Okay. Good morning, everyone. I think you will all realize that I'm not Dr. Moussa Shtewi, who is the chair of this morning's session, but I am deputizing for him. He is slightly delayed, and we will just, and I suggest that we simply start with this final session, or the final paper presenting session of this wonderful conference. It is my pleasure, as I will follow suit to the conventions that we had established in this conference, whereby there is no need for introducing speakers, as the program contains plentiful biographies of each. And I will simply, and without further ado, ask, first of all, Basma Qudmani to talk about the future of the Syrian state. Thank you, Basma.
Good morning. I will speak in English this morning because we were asked to prepare presentations which were, for me, were to be in English, so so I prepared in English. I think the question of that I posed is not one I will answer fully, but I would like to perhaps reflect with you on what Syria is all about and what it has been over the last 50 years. Not going further in history, I think Robert Saunders will be doing more of that in a very interesting way, but I will just say what we are experiencing today in terms of where Syria sits in the region and what's it and how it integrates into the region, and what is Syrian and what is regional about it. Because this is something we experience every day when discussing the future of Syria. It is the behavior of the players, it is the attitude of neighbors, it is also what the international community is looking at in terms of what Syria is. It's obvious that the history of the country is intermeshed with the history of the region. And it is a place which really has a contrast between the very rich production and dissemination of ideas, of ideological and political currents and visions, the cultural and civilizational influence that Syria has traditionally projected across the region, on one hand, and the fact that it was rarely a meaningful, cohesive player in the geopolitics of the Middle East. And one period, obviously, is the one that is described as the exception. That is the 30 years during which Hafez al-Assad ruled the country between 1970 and 2000. In that period, Syria seemed to make choices independently and to take a leading role on several key events and occasions. If we go back during those 30 years, the key events are the war of 1973, which was jointly decided by Egypt and Syria, the 1976 decision to intervene in Lebanon, the mobilization of an Arab coalition against Egypt after the Camp David agreements, the support for the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and in 1980, the decision to side with Iran against Iraq and the Arab Gulf countries. With that, Assad also gave a decisive turn to the Palestinian question when he fought Palestinian independent leadership, particularly Yasser Arafat, using Lebanese proxies to besiege starved refugee camps in Lebanon, but to basically bring under control the Palestinian leadership, Palestinian question, as he put it. In 91, he sided with the United States in approving the operation against Iraq for its invasion of Kuwait. In 96, the operation that was called Grapes of Wrath, this offensive by Israel against Hezbollah in Lebanon, in which Assad was also the key figure in resolving it. The rhetoric, the demeanor, the attitude, and the ability to influence, most often negatively, preventing things from happening or taking positions that have been hugely damaging to some of these issues and some of these players, they all led Syria to emerge as an important regional player. The strength of the Syrian leader at that time was to sell the idea across the Arab world that Syria was a fortress of resistance, and this is an image that until today Syria continues to enjoy among those countries who are not close and do not necessarily understand the full dynamics of what Syrian policy has been, but you do find still among Palestinians, among people in the Maghreb, that Syria has this image of a country that carries the banner of the nationalist causes and the Palestinian cause. The truth is that most of these choices, retrospectively, appear as motivated more by sectarian considerations. And a sectarian policy in that strategy required that no strong players emerge at the periphery that could rival Syria or could threaten the way, the policies it was developing. So clearly one of the most striking examples is Iraq and the enmity with Iraq and the decision and the choices to stand against Iraq with Iran on several occasions. The other very important dimension of those 3 decades is what I call the security trading. I think we are seeing also very strongly and very clearly today that the Syrian regime, and not Syria as a country, but the Syrian regime has worked with security, intelligence, as a commodity. You buy, you sell, you trade, there are transactions, deals, services you provide, and services you ask for. And I think that is a very crucial, critical feature of the system. Typically, if we go back also during those years, the radical Palestinian groups, which were controlled by the Syrian regime, allowed Assad back then to blackmail Arafat, but most importantly, since the 90s, is the role of jihadis, which is used as a precious commodity, was used during the Iraq War of 2003, the invasion of Iraq. It was used to negotiate with the United States. These jihadis are sent to Iraq. They fight the United States. The United States threatens to threaten Syria with regime change after Iraq. And the deal, the transaction, is those jihadis. Can you rein them in again? And Assad was willing to rein them in again in exchange for the safety, the security of his system, his power, his regime. Now that dimension, this is used in all relations, regionally, very importantly, but also internationally. And European countries, among others, are in a very close relation, were in a very close relationship with the Syrian intelligence system. This dimension today is crucial in understanding why it is important to maintain the Syrian regime for so many intelligence agencies, so many of the security apparatuses of regional and foreign countries, European countries as well, is a dimension which we measure today. And I think all of that was very smartly managed or engineered by the father of Bashar al-Assad, by Hafez al-Assad. Now, buying and selling security requires total security in the homeland, of course. And that was accompanied by nurturing distrust among communities. Assad father had worked to restructure society, to ascertain his role by demoting traditional leaders of communities and destroying power centers, religious, social, economic. And he was, to a large extent, successful. But he then worked to establish state authority as the one player who institutionalizes society by providing it with markers that signal order while injecting fear at every level. Assad's son inherited a machinery and continued the same policy. He ran the engine, but he didn't necessarily fully understand how it was engineered. Most importantly, I think he did not understand the political parts of it. And the balance between using the threat of force and the political management of a society, of a complex society such as Syria, that balance was not there. Those two sides of the strategy were not there anymore. That is where, that is what leads Syria at that point to begin to mismanage relations, particularly with neighbors and partners, alienating the Gulf countries, the Arab Gulf countries, committing the blunders we know in this country, and putting Syria under the gradual control of Iran. So when he was challenged, he revealed the total inability of the system to respond to Syria's challenge. We used the image of software, a software that doesn't have those functions to manage the challenge and adapt, introduce those reforms that undoubtedly could have stopped the movement back in 2011. Hence the extreme level of organized violence that was used against the whole society. the destruction of that system built by the father came about through the use of this extreme violence. Communities were punished for having rebelled. And we all know what we already discussed during the last 2 days, how the security, which we should call violent security, really, was taken away, as well as state services from those communities as a sanction, as a measure of punishing the population. Now, the populations used their agency to create alternative structures of governance and security. Yes, they established militias, armed groups. They also established local councils for civil administration. The most successful among them, and those who still remain today, are the organization of an autonomous administration with a powerful military force of the Kurds of what we call the PYD. This is largely because they were supported by the United States, by the US-led coalition, and most importantly, they were spared the air bombings, because elsewhere, those local structures were systematically bombed from the air with devastating effects on civilians. It was clear throughout that this was a deliberate strategy of recreating the vacuum which the populations had filled at a first time in 2011, 2012, to replace the structures of the state. It was designed to destroy a second time what had been created. And that was absolutely necessary from the regime's perspective. It was to reduce the organization of the population to the smallest social unit, i.e. the family, to be left alone with no possibility to organize ties within the community. That was the vacuum that was brought again in order to reinstate the power and the authority of the regime. It looked like a jar that is broken a first time into pieces, but could possibly have been pieced together again. But it is broken a second time, and this time pulverized into atom-sized units that cannot be reconstructed. And that was meant to deprive the people again from the agency they had created for themselves. So when the bombing had stopped because it had achieved its objectives, and that is what happened in these last 6 months, the other forms of extreme violence today are part of a new reality, and their features and these features of the extreme violence this time are more durable. They may not be as visible to the outside world, but they are more durable. This time, I think what we are seeing is that the durable dimension of it is that violence is harnessed in support of diverse forms of exploitation and annihilation of what was unpleasant for the regime from the perspective of organized communities. And this violence is durably embedded in what is a durable disorder. Is this damage fatal? Does that leave us with a country that cannot be pieced together? One thing that we have certainly, that we now understand in a clearer way, is that the international players, after having toyed with the idea of maybe changes to Syrian borders, reached a consensus on keeping the territory together. And following this was a decision, I think you all remember that over a good 2 years, the discussion was about, is the Sykes-Picot order finished because Syria is falling apart? And that showed how important Syria was for the region, but it also indicated that perhaps some of these pieces could go to neighboring countries or work differently. But that decision to keep the territory together was definitely a solid consensus internationally. Following the adagio of the golden age of Islam, which is 1,000 years of tyranny are preferable to 1 minute of anarchy. And based on this consensus, the re-engineering of an order in Syria was attempted, not attempted in the sense that it was actually implemented, but was designed. It's designed in Russia, but certainly in the United States, certainly Europe, the Gulf countries, the Arab world in general. Syria should stay together. But that doesn't provide the answer to what kind of society can exist or coexist on this territory. And more importantly, it creates different sets of conditions of security for different players, but not for Syria. So I think the biggest challenge today is that no player in Syria is working on rebuilding security for Syria as such. And the possibility of having a diplomatic political process that regulates, again, relations between communities and brings back a peaceful environment is really a very weak, has very weak credibility. There is no comprehensive framework for reestablishing security in the country. There is perhaps one effort which comes close to reestablishing security institutions, particularly the army. And that is the work of Russia, which is literally reorganizing the different divisions of the army, the leadership of the army, and is re-engineering the Syrian army. Apart from that, the security institutions and the security of the territory, whether it is the fight against terrorists or whether it is reinstating order, police forces, and security for the population. None of that is designed by anyone who thinks of Syria as Syria. And that, I think, is our biggest challenge in the coming period. What the United Nations uses as the template, the usual template for conflict resolution in many areas of the world, that approach doesn't draw the first line of what a settlement might bring to the people. It is about designing a new constitution. It is about organizing elections. My assessment of this, and I'm not the only one, is that that is not the right approach. That is not a roadmap for bringing back any peaceful arrangement for Syria. I think we have the first set of most urgent measures that need to happen to start suggesting that Syria will be populated with its people, that is for refugees to go back massively. That requires something different from a constitution and an election. That's not going to bring, in the next 5 years, it will not bring anything to resolve this issue. It will not bring It will not reassure anyone for going back or trying to live a normal life, whether it is refugees outside or those who were displaced to come back to their areas. I want to suggest maybe for the end of this presentation, two very simple measures that need to take place that do not require, for now, a replacement, a full replacement of the regime, but it does require a move that so far seems impossible. That is to obtain the guarantee that people will not be arrested. Not that detainees are released, that's a different one. It is the arrests themselves. And the guarantee also that people will not be forced to join the army to go and fight against Syrians, of course, because the fight is not against any other outside enemy. So those two measures, if they were to be forced on the regime, would already signal that Syrians are welcome to come back to their country and back to their areas. That is not on the agenda. It's not, neither on the UN's agenda nor on any other. These are important measures which would certainly sound real to people. There's a whole set of other measures which would signal to people that this place is livable after all, including for some time until we reach a political settlement and what is the desire of a large majority of the population, which is a real transition. But practical measures of this sort, including suspending, freezing, canceling what is called the law on terror, with the measures it allows against population. It is the arbitrary dimension that needs to be somehow begin to be addressed. It is only the arbitrariness that now at this point needs to happen for other measures to become credible. Then we can talk about the constitution, much later about elections, but certainly if there is no signal that something is bringing safety to this environment, I think we will be again posing the question, is Syria a country that can be brought together again? Thank you, I'll stop there.
شكرا. شكرا دكتورة مسمى. صباح الخير للجميع، وأنا آسف بعتذر يعني على التأخير. يعني ممكن إحنا نلومه على بعض الأشخاص بس مش ما في داعي، فأنا آسف كمان إنه خسرت جزء من المقدمة، لكن من خلال حضوري للحديث الدكتورة بسمة استعرضت بشكل يعني منظور خاص كيف تطور الوضع السياسي الأمني في سوريا، واللي هو كان يعني التحولات اللي حصلت بعد يعني قدوم بشار الأسد، يعني وعدم قدرته على المحافظة على المعادلات السابقة قد تكون أحد الأسباب اللي أدت إلى نشوء نوع من المجتمعات المحلية وأيضا التنظيمات السياسية. تركتنا الدكتورة بسمة في من جانب طمنتنا أنه ما في تقسيم لجغرافية سوريا، لكن من جانب آخر يعني تركتنا بنظرة نوعا ما متشائمة أنه المسار السياسي الحالي يعني قد لا يكون هو المسار يعني السياسي الأفضل. طبعا وضعت بعض الملاحظات أو الشروط اللي ممكن تساعد في يعني عودة اللاجئين و يعني مساهمتهم في بناء سوريا، علما أنه هذا ممكن يعني يكون للنقاش لاحقا، أن عودة اللاجئين السوريين لا تعتمد فقط على ما يدور بسوريا على موقف سوريا، في عوامل أخرى أنا بعتقد لازم يعني تأخذ بعين الاعتبار. الآن بترك المجال للدكتور بروفيسور روبرت ساندرز. هو طبعا يعني سوف يأتي بمنظور أيضا البعد العالمي في الأزمة السورية، والعنوان المحاضرة Extending the Kacham Religious Civilizational Vectors and Russia's Intervention in the Levant. So يعني that will be an added dimension for the discussion. Please, the floor is yours.
Shukran. So in the immortal words of Monty Python, now for something totally different. I want to, since I'll be the last paper presenter of the conference, I just want to take this opportunity to thank you for the invitation, and also extend my thanks to all the support staff who have been great and run a great conference. So thank you for having me here. I, alongside some of the other presenters, am not an expert in the Arab Middle East. I've done work on Muslims in Europe and also Muslim communities in the former Soviet Union. And so you'll see this is why I'm focusing a bit more on Russia, but with a case study about the ruins at Palmyra. Right. So in the mid-19th century, Tsarist Russia went to war with an international coalition of Western countries in the Ottoman Empire over the rights of Christian minorities in the Holy Land. And a half a century later, the Russian Federation launched a military campaign to support the Assad regime in Syria, pitting Moscow once again against France, Britain, Turkey, but also now the United States and various regional powers. In both of these interventions, these military interventions, the country of Russia was advancing a messianic mission based on, quote, unquote, protecting imperiled peoples and preserving civilization from chaos in their own discourse. In this paper, I'm actually operationalizing the work of a friend of mine, Maria Engström, who has used the concept of the katechan, basically the restraining shield, a biblical concept. But I'm also responding to Sidorov's call for scholars to go not only beyond classical geopolitics, but also prior to it. And in that way, we are bringing religion into the study of modern geopolitics. And so I do this with working through the sort of visual and the discursive geopolitics of Russia's current engagement in the Levant through the notion of withholding chaos. I'll go through a brief historical introduction of Russia's involvement in the Levant, and from there I'll start to move into the engagement in the Syrian conflict, ultimately shifting to the focus on the military concert that was performed in the ruins at Palmyra. And with this, I'm trying to basically talk about the framing of this intervention in religio-civilizational terms, and arguing that Russia is using the Levant as a key plank in its resumption of the long-held status of, and basically this is a mantle that it placed upon itself, as the global defender of traditional values, true religion, and genuine culture. Right. So in the paper, I'm basically combining eschatology, civilizationalism, and Russia's unique form of geopolitics called geopolitika, with some of the work of a number of Russian intellectuals, most famous of which you might be known to you as Alexander Dugin, who we have here saying as one of his quotes that American liberalism must be destroyed. So Dugin has been called by some, and I think this is a great exaggeration, as actually being Putin's brain. But he is emblematic of some of the sort of strategic thinking that has gone into Putin's administration during its development of foreign policy from 2000 forward. Obviously, he's been the president, then prime minister, and now is once again president of Russia. And a lot of this hinges on not only on the discourse of Eurasianism, that Russia has a very special role to play in its own region, but increasingly that Russia has a special role to play on the global scale. And this is in many ways in opposition to, its goals are in opposition to the goals that were employed during the Soviet period, but at the same time is a mirroring, a sort of resumption of basically of that very, very important role in world affairs. At the same time, Putin is very careful to draw upon much earlier sort of roots and fundamentals of Russian foreign policy. And these have to do with the notion of Russia as a quote-unquote third Rome, that it had picked up this mantle from Byzantium after the fall of Constantinople. And as Engstrom phrases it, when this actually occurs, that Muscovy felt that God, it seemed, was granting Russians freedom because he had chosen them as successors to the second Rome. Right. So with the beginning of Catherine the Great's rule, you have this notion that it is the job of Russia to protect Christians in the East, in the Eastern Mediterranean. And ultimately, this will put Russia on this, on this trajectory towards war with the British and the French, who were supporting the Ottoman Empire. In a very short period of time, the Ottoman Turkey had turned from the terror of the world in the minds of many of the Western Christian nations, basically into the sick man of Europe, needing the defense of these Western powers against the encroachment of Russia, which in their view was headed towards Constantinople and eventually into the Eastern Mediterranean. And the conflict ultimately begins over something as simple as a set of keys. Basically, at the behest of the French, the Turkish authorities hand over the keys to a church in Jerusalem, thus creating a political crisis in the region, which ultimately spreads far beyond the region. Eventually, what you see is a declaration of war by Turkey, and then eventually the powers have to figure out where are they going to fight. And ultimately, the decision is to fight upon the Crimean Peninsula. And what I'm going to do, and what I do in the paper, is basically connect Crimea and specifically the territory of Ukraine to the Levant, to the Eastern Mediterranean during these two periods of conflict. The way that the war is ultimately framed inside the Russian discourse is that it is a war for the manger of God, because it is being fought on the Crimean Peninsula, that God had called upon Russia to go and fight the Turks, and also to fight the West, who was backing them. Just to give you a little bit of background of why the Crimea is so important, this is the place where Vladimir was actually baptized, and then ultimately he would go and baptize the Russian nation. So it is sort of the originary site of Christianity for the Russian people. And so then it is connected during the Crimean War, both visually in terms of popular cultural representation, and certainly discursively through this notion of the Crimean War as being the war for the manger of God, connecting these two very sacral spaces. This conflict, when it occurs, creates conditions where some of Russia's philosophers really begin to articulate a division between themselves and the Western powers, beginning to see the Western powers as agents of chaos in terms of world affairs, and that it is Russia's job basically to defend the world against this chaos that they are stirring up. And this is where this notion of Katehan, which has been reintroduced into the Russian discourse in the post-2000 era, really comes into play, that this notion that Russia is holding back the forces of nihilism, of chaos, of destruction, and basically at that point equating the West on one hand and also the forces of ISIL, which I'll be talking about later, on the other hand, as basically elements or representatives of the Antichrist on Earth. And so these things basically play into this much, much larger discourse that Russia has been pushing. Eventually, Russia loses this war and is forced, or at least kind of tucks its tail between its legs and turns its face eastward, eventually moving in and consolidating power in the North Caucasus, conquering parts of Central Asia, including the Emirate of Bukhara and the Khiva, the Khanate of Khiva. And it is during this period that Russia, the Tsar, actually begins to develop this very strange relationship with Islam that is somewhat cooperative, somewhat collaborative. It has been recognized as, in terms of this sort of imperial relationships, one of the ones where Islam and the European conqueror were able to come to sort of better ways of understanding one another and bringing up stability to the area. And this only fed into this larger sort of self-image of Russia as being able to bring civilization, peace, and security to the world. So we have this sort of early position, right? Okay. So I just wanted to show you a couple of images here. So this is where all the hubbub begins. A representation here of the defense of Crimea. And then ultimately, after the defeat in Crimea, Russia moving into Central Asia and establishing its control over the region there. So during this period, you have the sort of evolution of a new way of thinking of Russia, a new way of thinking about religion, about its role sort of in this civilizational battle. However, there is then this massive rupture that occurs with the Soviet Revolution. The upending of world politics, basically Trotsky publishing all of this information, secret information that he's able to locate about the eventual partition of the Ottoman Empire. And then from this point forward, the Soviet Union becomes an agent of chaos in world affairs, particularly in the Middle East. The sort of Third International, the push for world revolution, ultimately will lead to a realpolitik on the part of the Soviets. But certainly if you look in the immediate post-war World War II era, Stalin's push to have the creation of a Jewish state, and then after the quote-unquote loss of Israel to the Western powers, a continuing push to create problems within countries like Iran and Turkey by using ethnic minorities. And then eventually during Khrushchev and Brezhnev, you have the push, basically the positioning of the Soviet Union as a supporter, as we heard in a sort of the analogies of it in the previous presentation, the sort of shoring up of the Arab nationalist states in the region. All of this starts to come to an end with Mikhail Gorbachev's new thinking in terms of foreign policy of the Soviet Union. That is a sort of the goal to bring an end to that sort of chaos mongering that had been going on during the Soviet era. And then you have the shift during the Yeltsin administration during the 1990s to a policy of Atlanticism, sort of remaking of old alliances and shoring up of old alliances and remaking new alliances. And the Middle East in many ways is simply forgotten during the Yeltsin administration. However, this begins to change under Vladimir Putin. And I argue that it was really the way was paved for him by the foreign minister of Yeltsin, Yevgeny Primakov, who is an Arab specialist, a fluent Arab speaker, and had many relationships with Arab leaders around the world. And he also, his main policy goals while he was foreign minister, while it was a short-lived period, was basically to end the United States' sort of unipolar moment and have a return to multipolarity. Part of this is developing a much stronger relationship with Iran, but also he proposed a relationship with India and China, basically to balance the United States globally. During this period, you're starting to see a large shift of Russian foreign policy in the region, while maintaining some of the relations with Arab states, also developing new ones, particularly with Iran, to basically offset, as I said before, offset U.S. dominance, and this is involvement in the development of the nuclear energy program. But more importantly, the really dramatic relationship change was with Israel, and this has a lot to do with the fact that you have over 1 million Russophones living in Israel today, excellent business connections, technology exchange, etc. And then more recently, you have the shift to actually developing relationships with the Gulf states, so really a radical departure of past Russian foreign policy. As Kasula and Kassa pointed out, though, when Russia is involved in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Levant, in the Arab world, their policy is identity-driven and very much informed by history. And so this is what I'm trying to bring that analysis really into the work that I'm doing here. So Moscow's Syria policy. It is a continuation of the Soviet ties. The USSR was one of the first countries to recognize Syria's independence even before the departure of the French. It used this relationship with Syria used it basically to continue to sort of balance against Western dominance, certainly by having a port facility in the Eastern Mediterranean was an important part of maintaining that relationship. As the Arab Spring comes, so-called Arab Spring comes into view, Putin sees this as simply an extension of these color revolutions which had really disrupted his influence across the former Soviet Union, specifically in Georgia and Ukraine, but also in Kyrgyzstan, and attempted color revolutions in other places. So he sees this really in terms of more of the United States sort of fomenting chaos in parts of the world where Russia has vested interests. And then over time, one of the real drivers and the decision, the sort of decision as it was presented to the Russian people of why Russia needs to engage militarily in Syria has to do with this high percentage of Russophone or Russian-speaking members of ISIL. Many of them coming from Central Asia, but also from the North Caucasus, some of them with a good deal of military experience. They're veterans of the conflicts in the North Caucasus, which we should remember. Basically, the resumption of the war in Chechnya was what brought Vladimir Putin into power in 1999 into 2000 as Yeltsin's health was failing. And so we see with the sarin gas attack, Kremlin really gets a chance to expand its footprint and its imprint on the region, becoming the sort of primary negotiator for keeping the West at bay to avoiding those airstrikes that were promised, and ultimately with the disposal and destruction and removal of the main infrastructure associated with the Assad regime's chemical weapons. So just a brief overview, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but a brief overview of the Syrian campaign prior to the Palmyra concert that I'm going to be talking about. You have in late September of 15, the Duma approves military action in Syria. Russian missile strikes begin, also the air campaign begins, and then moving into October, you see Assad thanking Russia for its help and bringing about a turning point in the war. As you had mentioned before, the whole notion of partition had really been on the table until this point. And so it is at that point that there is this possibility, or so there's the notion that partition might not happen actually becomes somewhat of a reality. A real stumbling block for Russian sort of Russian goals was when one of its warplanes was shot down by Turkey in November 5th, the 24th of November, creating sort of international controversy around this, but ultimately that we see a reversal of this antipathy between Ankara and Moscow over time because of a coming together, I think, I would argue, on a much sort of larger geopolitical issues, but also sort of common goals within Syria over time. Russian ground troops are deployed in December, and shortly thereafter we see a sort of the United States and eventually Britain and other European countries pushing back and beginning to accuse Russia of weaponizing the refugee crisis. So real internationalization of the Russian intervention. 14th of March, Putin announces impending withdrawal of most of the troops, declaring the objectives have been mostly achieved. And then shortly thereafter, Syrian troops with Russian support, also including Spetsnaz support on the ground, surround Palmyra, which doesn't have a huge strategic value. Fabrice might argue with me about this, but it really is about the spectacle of the event, and that's what my argument is about. And so in the paper I talk about the theory of securitizing cultural objects, securitizing cultural heritage as a sort of evolving space within a sort of global power projection, how it can become really a tool of foreign policy, one that extends far beyond bilateral relations or regional relations. And this is a photograph of Russian sappers basically removing mines in advance of the concert, which I'm going to show you two videos of since I have a little bit of extra time today. So the first video I'm going to show you is RT coverage. So for those of you who remember, the Russian military invited in a large number of Western media outlets, but also gave privileged coverage to RT and Sputnik, which are Russia's two basically whether they're state-owned or state-run is a bit of a debate, but two state broadcasters which focus on the English language as well as airing in Arabic, Spanish, and many other international languages. So I want to give you the RT coverage first, and hopefully the sound
Russian
works.
orchestra has staged a concert in the recently liberated ancient city of Palmyra. The event was called Pray for Palmyra and was dedicated to those who lost their lives during the devastating war in Syria. RT's Paula Sleer has more.
It's very emotional to be here in the ancient city of Palmyra, where just a short time ago the pictures coming out were those of death and destruction as Islamic State tried to obliterate this part of the world. But now, as you hear and see behind me, there is a classical concert on the go. Valery Gergiev, the renowned Russian composer, opened the concert with the words that peace and prosperity have now come back to Palmyra, and this is hugely symbolic. Death and destruction have been replaced with harmony, peace, civilization, and history. Among the audience are Russian soldiers, there are Syrian soldiers, there are ordinary civilians, a lot of school children, and also a delegation from UNESCO. And as you can hear, people here are highly appreciative of the classical music that is now reverberating through these ancient ruins. I was talking to some of those members of the UNESCO delegation, and they said it's still difficult to say exactly how long it will take to revive this ancient city and return it to the state it was in before Islamic State came.
You know, it's very difficult now to evaluate this damage. It will be done a little bit later by the group of specialists.
The concert is entitled Pray for Palmyra. Music revives ancient ruins. And certainly that's what we're hearing. The music here is reviving what Islamic State tried to destroy. Paula Sleer, RT, Palmyra.
All right, so very clear presentation that this is the reclamation of a space for global civilization. As The Economist framed it, the music's message was clear. There is civilization and there is barbarism. Stand with Russia on the side of good. There were some very explicit connections made about this concert and the siege of Leningrad, in which you had a similar concert being performed basically as the Nazis have encircled the city. So there was a discussion of that as well, basically sort of hearkening back to Russia defending the world from Axis chaos. But it was also used very much in the Russian press as a way to begin to work against the West, right? To show that the West really had, and particularly the United States with its intervention in Iraq, had created the chaos of ISIS, and then ultimately that shifts into, of IS, and that ultimately shifts into the near destruction of the Syrian state. And it is only through this intervention on the behalf of the Russians that this site is saved for all of society. And so what I want to do is I want to contrast that now with a report done by CNN, who was at the same place at the same time, to see how the coverage is done by Western media.
Attack helicopters hovering over our convoy at all times for protection. Russia's army went to great lengths to bring a massive group of journalists to the ancient Syrian city of Palmyra, recently liberated from ISIS. When we arrived, a surprise, a classical concert featuring a Russian star director right in the ancient amphitheater, and a greeting from Russian President Vladimir Putin. This concert is a way to thank those who fight against terror, he said, ready to sacrifice their lives. The star musician Sergei Roldugin, named in the Panama Papers for alleged links to offshore companies with cash flows of hundreds of millions of dollars. He has denied any wrongdoing. Also on hand, Russian soldiers who demined Palmyra after ISIS was ousted, a sign of the pride Russia takes in its Syria intervention. Palmyra was liberated from ISIS control in late March after the Syrian army launched a massive offensive.
When ISIS moved into Palmyra, many experts feared the worst, that the terror group would flatten this entire remarkable ancient site. But when ISIS was driven out of here by the Syrian military, of course with a lot of support by the Russian Air Force, the experts were surprised to find how much of it remained intact.
But some treasures, like Palmyra's Triumph Arch, were destroyed. Now experts are debating how to restore them. But threats, like unexploded ordnance, remain. While Russian demining teams have cleared both the ancient city and a nearby town, they are also training Syrian troops to find and destroy explosive devices. The commander says the bombs ISIS left behind were particularly sophisticated. ISIS left bombs behind that were professionally made, he said. We found high-grade explosives and at least 3 suicide vests. Russia clearly views the liberation of Palmyra as a major victory, not only for the Syrian government, but for their forces as well. One they want the world to take note of, even as Syria's civil war drags on. Fred Plankin, CNN, Palmyra, Syria.
So the contrast here for the Russians was to put this bit of culture in this space after the exact same space had been used for executions of civilians in the months previous, and also the lead archaeologist had actually been beheaded in the site, and then his body hung from one of the Roman columns. And so this was marked out in the Russian press and also in other world press outside the United States and Great Britain as a huge accomplishment. And one, as I argue in the paper, really goes to this sort of civilizationist identity that Russia is trying to promote. Certainly within parts of the Arab Middle East, however, there was pushback against this, that it really was simply a propaganda show. And so in the paper, what I deal with is sort of this balancing, this framing of different forms of representation over using this particular space, which has this very special history in terms of sort of the world patrimony. What's interesting to me is that this is a pagan site, right? It is, and could have very easily, in terms of the Russian discourse about orthodoxy, about Russian orthodoxy, about civilizationalism, could have been interpreted in a completely different way. However, on the part of the Russian, basically on the Russian framing of this, it was something for everyone in the world. And so it was something that had come under threat by the forces of nihilism and barbarism, as they often refer to ISIS as, or ISIL as, with basically conditions that were created by Western powers. The stalking horse, as I argue in the paper, for this concert was, however, Ukraine and Crimea once again. In many ways, this spectacle was a way for, I argue, a way for Russia to distract from the annexation of Crimea and the ongoing involvement in the Donbass, in the eastern part of Ukraine. A concert like that would have been impossible to perform in basically within Crimea. Any sort of propaganda demonstration along those lines would have been impossible for the Russians to do and achieve any goals in terms of their international reputation. However, in framing it the way that they did against ISIL violence and basically bringing stability to the Middle East was in many ways as being seen, particularly now with the decision of the United States to remove its troops in December, is being seen as a sort of turning point. And I would even say, even though ISIL takes Palmyra in the months after this and then it is again reclaimed, this is probably going to be a footnote to history, that there was this basically turning over of the site once again. Looking at it sort of more largely, Russia was able to, in terms of its military engagement, I would argue that it was able to sort of pull off something quite successful. It did not repeat the events of Afghanistan, the intervention in Afghanistan. It did not suffer what basically the United States has suffered in Iraq and its continuing wars in Afghanistan, of basically being dragged in, having a long engagement that they can't get out of. Is the West sort of chastened by this successful Russian intervention? This is an open question that I'm curious about. Is, as many people or many analysts, geopolitical analysts now saying, is Russia ascendant in the Eastern Mediterranean at this point? Again, it really is a sort of unanswered question. And also, there are so many counter-narratives to this notion of Russia as this restrainer of chaos in the world. Which one of these is going to win out at the end of the day? So at the end of the paper, I'm left with as many questions as I have answers, but I'm certainly happy to leave it there and open it up for discussion. So thank you.
Thank you very much. شكرا جزيلا. يعني حقيقة الورقة بشكل دقيق وملفت، يعني حاولت تظهر البعد الديني الحضاري في كدافع أساسي من دوافع لتدخل روسيا ليس فقط في سوريا وإنما في المنطقة يعني عالميا على المسرح العالمي، وتأخذ لاستعادة مكانتها أيضا نوعا ما في المسرح العالمي، بالإضافة طبعا إلى الأبعاد التاريخية، العلاقة التاريخية مع سوريا، والمصلحة أيضا السياسية والاقتصادية في هذا الموضوع. أكيد هذا يعني يثير كثير من الجدل، يعني هذا الموقف يعني يحتاج إلى يعني تحليل، لأنه كما أشار البروفيسور ساندرز ممكن يكون في كاونتر أرجومنتس لهذا الموضوع. بنفتح المجال للنقاش، معنا تقريبا 20 إلى 25 دقيقة، فاللي بيحب يسأل أو يعلق رجاء ارفعوا ايديكم. تفضل دكتور حسام، لأنه أول واحد رفع ايده، مش لأنه بنعطيه يعني
شكرا
أولوية.
شكرا. إذا في أي حدث.
لا أنت أول واحد رفعت ايده.
صباح الخير. Good morning everybody. Thank you for an excellent presentations. I'll try to make it quite concise. It's for Basma. Basma and I share, I think, most of the ideas. We are on the same line. But something just caught my attention, the idea of that the international community reached a consensus to keep the borders of Syria intact. Does anyone still believe that the international powers, whether in 1916 or today, really have? Does anybody take that now seriously, that they have formed these countries, that they can alter these countries, that they can divide them? I thought that this idea is just history now, this concept. I'm sorry to say that this myth, okay, I thought that everybody has taken it. Now you have one exception, which is Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan. And because this is a case that has been evolving over the past 50 years, it's not because of international consensus. It could have happened last year but apart from that, suppose the West did not reach such a consensus, how would you divide Syria? What state would you establish? Where would you establish it? Which country would annex what? I mean, these are, I don't think this is a favor that they have done. I think they simply cannot. No international, no foreign power can create social facts, socio-economic facts on the ground. And this has been, but that's controversial. This has been my view, and I've written about it, even about this myth of two officers in 1916 sitting now. This we'll call it Iraq, this we will call it Syria, and etc. That was a myth, but many people would not agree with me on that. But today, at 2018, we still believe in this. Thank you.
تفضل أستاذ. مايك لو سمحت.
Thank you, Mr. Shtewi. I would like to thank our two communicators, Madam Kodmani and Mr. Saunders. Madam Kodmani, to be honest with you, if really you want to rebuild and reconstruct your country, all the Syrian refugees has to come back. We have two parts in Syria. We have the regime part and the anti-regime. So both of them can choose the part in which they want to live as a first step. And after that, when you are inside the country, with elections and so on, you can change. But you cannot ask now these two conditions. This is very honestly. Concerning Mr. Saunders, you gave us an historic communication about Russia, but really, I'm wondering really if it's a scientific communication or just a propaganda. That's all, to be honest. I respect you. I thank you again for all what you have give us. But really, this is what I am feeling. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anybody else? خذ الميكروفون على الآخر حبيبي.
أنا عندي سؤالين. السؤال الأول إلى بسمع حول ما قال عصام. حقيقة عندما تابعنا الوضع من عام 14 إلى 18 إلى سقوط الرقة قبلها الموصل، على أقل تقدير على المستوى الدولي الذي كان له صوت وتأثير كبير في الأزمتين أصبحت متلازمتين في العراق وسوريا، كانت هناك ديناميكية تقبل في بعض الأحيان تشجع إلى إعادة رسم حدود المنطقة. على أقل تقدير لم تكن بهذه الدرجة من الاندفاع في الولايات المتحدة واحتمال بريطانيا، بس أوروبا كأوروبا أنا من الناس اللي كثير استجوبت في يعني دعوات للحديث في مكانات كانت إذا برلمانية أو استشارية. أنا كنت أقاوم الرأي اللي هو أساساً يريد يستشير بأنه الوجهة كانت تكون أسلم لو يتم تفكير بحدود المنطقة. لم يتم التطرق إلى سايكس بيكو قبل سنتين بقدر ما تم في أوروبا، وبحقيقة وبشكل زائف على أقل تقدير تاريخيا، لأنه سايكس بيكو كمشروع ما تطبق. هو كان مشروع، لو كان مطبق احنا العراقيين نكون سعداء، لأنه حدود العراق الجنوبية كانت تصبح الدوحة. فعمليا هذا الشيء يعني
محافظة 20
يعني الحديث كان أنه الصيغة اللي جرت هناك حيف تاريخي ويجب إصلاح هذا الحيف التاريخي. بالعكس أنا أقول بأنه لو كان يجري التقسيم، لو كان يتم سايكس بيكو لكن قرن بعد تقريبا، إذا تأخذون الخريطة ضمن نفس الخريطة، هي تبدأ من الموصل وتنتهي عند أبواب الشام. توبي دوتش عمل هذا الموضوع أيضا، وإحنا عملنا هذا الموضوع. على كل حال سيناريو التقسيم كان مطروح، وحقيقة وهذا ما مشى، لأنه ديناميكية الدول منذ قرن، أنا هذا رأيي، هي اللي غلبت في هذا الجانب. النقطة الثانية من ناحية الآثار، أنا أعمل في لجنة دولية بمبادرة من فرنسا، الرئيس الفرنسي، لإنقاذ الآثار، وأنا أمثل الدولة العراقية في هذه اللجنة بعد ما حل في نمرود ومناطق أخرى. ما نتأسف إلا حقيقة إن كان من خلال الدولة السورية ومن خلال المعارضة السورية ومن خلال الرأي العام العالمي لا يتم إطلاقا الحديث عن الحيف الذي لحق بالآثار السورية، وهي هائلة. الآن بدأت هناك كميات من المال تأتي لإنقاذ ما يمكن إنقاذه في بعض المشاريع حوالي الموصل، في مشاريع أخرى الآن في أفريقيا أيضا، نفكر في ليبيا، ولكن ليس هناك حديث حقيقة ماذا يجري على ما لحق في سوريا، وهو دمار كبير. مواقع مهمة أساسية للمعرفة التاريخية والبشرية حقيقة تم تدميرها إلى الآن ولا يتم الحديث عنها. ما أتحدث فقط عن تدمر، عن ماري، عن مناطق أخرى، عن العشرات في بعض الأحيان المئات من المواقع في منطقة الجزيرة. هذا فد خراب كبير، وللأسف احنا واقعين بين المطرقة والسندان، النظام من جهة والواقع الدولي داعش. فلذلك مدى يتم الحديث عن هذا الموضوع والآثار والحضارة السورية في هذا الجانب هي الضحية الأولى في هذا المجال، وأنا دا أطرحها لأنه ما في حل إلى الآن. في كل الاجتماعات اللي ساهمت بها عندما نوصل إلى الموضوع السوري يتم هناك فد نوع من السكوت المحزن، بعض الأحيان أقول حتى مخجل. يعني هذا بس مجرد أطرحها أيضا للتذكير.
شكرا. Folks, please.
Yeah, sorry. I was just sitting next to Hisham, so I take the advantage of the mic.
No, I'm sorry. I gave the.
Oh, sorry, I was.
We'll get back to you.
Okay.
That's
Okay, my first question is to Robert Saunders. I was just wondering, to what extent is the narrative of civilization protection constructed, and to what extent does the leadership of Russia actually believe in it itself? And the second question to Basma Kotmani, I would agree that, as we often have said, elections is not enough, constitution building is not enough. We need that security for the population, for the refugees. But is that enough, or does it need in the long run another political process that will enable those who have been refugees to finally participate and not being marginalized again in the political process and in society? Thanks.
Setane, and then we'll go back to you.
The question's for Dr. Saunders. I wonder if I could just ask you to elaborate a little more on the implications of Russia fighting its own insurgents in Syria, given the high number of Central Asians and North Caucasians within ISIL. So they're fighting their own insurgents as much as they are, establishing stability in Syria. And are people coming back? Are these fighters coming back? What's the policy internally towards them? Is there a new front, a new ISIL front or ISIS or whatever in Central Asia, forming in Central Asia at the moment? Is that the next stage, actually?
Virginia, please.
Yeah, thank you. A question to Robert. I was wondering to what extent the way you presenting the framing of Russian policy as a protection for civilization is actually the main way in which it's presented in front of the Russian audience and public, or it's also counterbalanced by other interests. I'm wondering, you mentioned a turn in the Putin's policy towards more interest-driven strategy in the region. Is it also part of the way the intervention in Syria is presented, or not at all? Thank you.
Please. Denise, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Basma a question. I agree totally that the post-conflict reconstruction blueprints have been tried and failed already twice. We've had Afghanistan, Iraq. Clearly it's not going to work. But one thing that is out of genuine curiosity, what tends to happen in situations of mass displacement is that there are processes of expropriation and redistribution which erect massive obstacles to any restitution or return. That's at the material level. But also at another level, you also have a process of revanchism and revenge-taking, which spreads at the grassroots level, which creates phenomenal obstacles. I wonder, and I'm just trying to be not too pessimistic, whether something like the mere suspension of arrests or a guarantee of not arresting further people, and what was the other one? You had two conditions, and stopping conscription. I personally think that these would go maybe some way, but I very much doubt that they would go further, because you see, when processes of violent redistribution start taking place, when violence is used as a tool for redistribution, you first have to study the sorts of vested interests that have formed around the newly created. You have to have a good reading of the foci of resistance. They form very quickly. I mean, in Afghanistan, the drug economy created facts on the ground which are, almost immovable. So I don't know if anybody has a reading of that. I mean, actually in different localities. Because, societies don't like vacuums, as you know. Those gaps are immediately filled with formations that actively then resist, an evolution towards the path you would like to take into. So I want a reflection on that. I mean, or maybe there is work and I'm not aware of it. And I think, Robert, that much as I respect the sort of longue durée idea that, you know, the importance of ideas in foreign relations, I think on the Russian one, I'm going to be a realist, I'm afraid, you know, and lapse into, you know, crude, because we can't understand what's going on there, in my view, unless we understand the little bit of what happened between the fall of the Soviet Union, Yeltsin, and the transition from Yeltsin to Putin. I think that is much more determinant than Dugin, who I think he's a bit player. People take him very seriously in Turkey, where we also have Eurasianists, by the way. You know, even though they're Muslims, you know, they think we should all, you know, unite against the West, etc. But I think there that the expansion of NATO, you know, and the reaction to the expansion of NATO has created, it's like, what's going on here? And of course, the betrayal of Russia, because they thought they were going to be let into the club. And not only didn't that happen, but during the sort of drunken reign of Yeltsin, they plundered, you know, the economy and handed it out to people. And it was a kind of, it wasn't a shield anymore. It was a regaining of dignity of after the Soviet Union, they had been dragged through the mud. The Westerners came and treated them like a third world country. Experts were everywhere in Moscow telling them how to run a market economy. So it was almost, as it were, a kind of national wound being healed. Now, different people do it differently. I admit that in Russia there were loads of throwbacks to Tsarist glories, etc., etc. But I think that this has more explanatory value than the kind of long, you know, than the strain of, you know, thinking that starts a long way back, etc. It is part of the arsenal of the kind of neo-nationalist movement in Russia, no doubt about it. But how, whether it's, I mean, after all, Syria was its one foothold, military foothold, and you wouldn't want to abandon that anyway, you know, never mind. And I think the Palmyra thing has echoes of the way in which formations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS were treated. Remember the Buddhas of Bamyan. It was again the same discourse of civilization versus barbarism. So although I'm in sympathy theoretically with a sort of move, I'm doubtful about its efficacy. Adding, of course, Setani's comment of having their own truck with the militants who could return home and wreak havoc, who have already wreaked havoc in the opera, etc., etc. Yeah, thanks.
Please.
شكرا جزيلا على هذه المحاضرة المثيرة بصراحة. يعني اللي افتهمته من دكتورة بسمة انه النظام ما اعرف لاي اسباب. نعم، النظام السوري، النظام في سوريا يعني الامن سواله سوق، قام يبيع الامن. يعني حقيقة ظاهرة خطرة جدا، يعني حول من سلعة عامة يعني تحمي النظام الى سلعة خاصة، بدليل أن العراق عام 2009 اتهم سوريا بالأمم المتحدة في تفجيرات خطيرة في بغداد، استهدفت وزارة الخارجية العراقية ووزارة المالية، ولو الصفحة مطوة هسه ونست، بس هكذا كانت. أنا أعتقد يعني في ظل الأوضاع في سوريا اليوم الأمن سلعة خاصة، برايفت جودز، يعني وخطرة هاي جدا. يعني اليوم تلقى القبضايات والأشقياء والمتنفذين هم الأمن بصراحة. حتى بلد ينبني من جديد بصراحة هاي فلسفة خطرة، يعني يرجع الأمن العام هو سلعة عامة public goods. من يدخل بهالأشياء هاي من يصير سوق له حقيقة تدمير كامل للأشياء هاي. يعني ما أدري وجهة نظري. السيد روبرت بصراحة أنا دائما أفكر أن الوجود الروسي في سوريا بعد أوكرانيا هو شيء من الحرب الباردة بالحقيقة، أو بداية جديدة لحرب باردة بصراحة، أو ظهور قطبية ثنائية من جديد. يعني القطبية الأحادية بدأت تختفي، تظهر القطبية الثنائية، يعني تظهر شيء آخر من الحرب الباردة. يعني لكن ساحة الاختبار مالتها هي سوريا. بالنهاية اكو وجود روسي يستمر على البحر الأبيض مقابل أوكرانيا وإلى آخره. أنا بتقديري إيران تنسحب، إسرائيل محمية من الحليف الجديد بالحقيقة، والتسوية تصير بهذا الاتجاه. وجهة نظري الشخصية، ما أدري، يجوز مخطئ جدا. يعني شكرا جزيلا.
مجال سؤال أو سؤالين إذا في حدا. تفضل.
بس هو كومنت سريع جدا بموضوع الآثار السورية. أنا وصلت متأخر على الحديث، بس ما بعرف إذا نذكر الشغل اللي عم بيعمله عمرو العظم من هذا المنطلق، يعني عامل مبادرات. هو بيشتغل صراحة نسيت اسم الجامعة بأمريكا، بس إجا حتى على عصام فارس، وكان في 2 day conference عن كيف حاولوا بمحل معين حماية الآثار السورية، الهيريتج ان جنرال. صار في حديث مطول حول الحجر أو البشر، يعني بحالات الصراع كيف بتتم. حتى نحكى عن الايكونومي اللي ظهر بعد ما أخذت داعش محلات، إنه أراضي معينة، كيف صار في تنقيب، كيف صار في بيع حقوق التنقيب وكل هالمواضيع. ففي شغل منيح على هذا الموضوع، يمكن بس ما عم بيتضوى عليه زيادة.
أوكي. شكرا. الآن نعود إلى المتحدثين. 5 دقائق دكتورة بسمة، تفضلي.
طيب، النقاش حول التقسيم أو عدم أو تغيير الحدود يعني هو كان داير الحقيقة، يعني كان موجود وفعلا حكى فيه بعدة أوساط. مثلا أنه منطقة السويدة هذه ترتبط بشكل أو بآخر بإسرائيل. هلأ إعادة رسم الحدود بشكل رسمي يعني ما انحكى، ما وصلنا لهي المرحلة. أنا أعتقد أنه كان في تفكير جاد بهذا الأمر، وبعدين مراجعة هذه الفكرة بالكامل. ولكن الأخطر شيء في القرار هو أنه بقاء سوريا بحدودها الحالية يتطلب بقاء هذا النظام، وهذا أخطر شيء. هذا أخطر شيء. وهذا المعضلة اللي اليوم نحن ما حدا عم بيقدر يعالجها بشكل جدي. يعني الكلام على الانتقال السياسي غير مقنع بصراحة من أي طرف. وفي أي طرف بيحكي عن الانتقال السياسي بشكل جدي. وأعتقد أنه في حالة من يعني عدم النظر إلى الواقع، denial، أنه طيب خلي بركي بس هيك بيحسن شوي تصرفاته، تعامل مع العالم بشكل مختلف. ففي هالحالة هاي اللي العودة إلى واعتقد الاستخدام الامن يعني ترانزاكشنال سيكيورتي اللي حكينا هو كان يعني تبلور انه واتضح انه هو اهم ضمان لبقائه. حقيقة اليوم تحويله فعلا لسلعة اصبح اليوم انه كل دولة بتروح على سوريا بتطلب من اجهزة الامن إنها تخدمها خدمة بشكل عن الموضوع الأمني. يعني الصيني رايح يشوف الويغور اللي قاتلوا في سوريا بركي بيضبهم بشار الأسد. الفرنسي بيروح بركي هدول الجهاديين ما بيرجعون بس يقبرون مطرح ما هنن. التركي متأمل إنه بالأخير بركي بتضب سوريا هالأكراد ونخلص من هالمشكلة. فهي الفكرة إنه هاي سياسة الترانزاكشنال سيكيورتي حقيقة ضامنة أكبر ضامن
من السبعينات حافظ الأسد يتعامل كان حافظ الأسد يتعامل مع الأمن كسلعة، ومن هنا ظهرت تعبير استراتيجيك الريع الاستراتيجي. كان يبيع الأمن للسعودية، وإلا أفجر كذا وكذا أو أخطف فلان أو فلان في لبنان. كانت سلعة في لبنان. كنعان هو كان مسوقها، وكان هناك تقسيمات. من ذلك الوقت كانت هناك كان الأسد يتعامل معها كسلعة.
شكرا يا عصام.
تمام. فيعني أعتقد إنه هذا البعد للتركيبة الحالية هي إنه لن يكون يعني هناك حدود لسوريا تبقى، ولكن أمن سوريا ليس أمن سوريا، أمن كل الآخرين وليس سوريا. دمار الآثار طبعا، وبشكر هشام على يعني التركيز على انه هذه فعلا الضحيه الاولى. وبالنسبه يعني لما يكون فيها الازمه في مؤسسات الدوله، يبقى التاريخ والثقافه والاثار هي الركيزه الاساسيه للهويه. وحقيقة هذا أخطر شيء بالنسبة للهوية السورية اليوم، هو تدمير هذا الشيء، لأنه المؤسسات اللي قائمة، يعني كل البوليتيكال كونستراكت تبع سوريا فاشل بشكل كامل. وحتى قبل عصر بيت الأسد، يعني هذا الشيء ما نجحت سوريا في إنها تأسس لدولة بمؤسسات، أو ما صمدت المؤسسات اللي طورت في البداية وكانت لساتها هشة، وتم الاستيلاء عليها من خلال أجهزة مجرمة وليست أجهزة أمن. فهذه الركيزة فعلا إذا عم بتروح، فهي فعلا تآكل في الهوية السورية. بالنسبة للبوليتيكال بروسيس انحكى من قبل أستاذ فوغت، I will answer your question. Please get me right. I am not saying that do these things and do not do political transition. I am saying test the reality check for a gradual process of change, because the decision is to maintain the current political system in place. The reality check is, can you get anything from it to start? And if that works, then maybe we can go a step further and several steps further. You can hear my skepticism on this, but I'm saying nevertheless, this is the first thing to do instead of drafting a beautiful constitution which will help in nothing, all right? So, of course, and the whole issue of the political process is about sequencing. The failed approaches and strategies followed in Afghanistan, Iraq is different, but Libya, look at Libya. Typically, no security arrangements, go straight to putting a transitional governing council and then a government in place, and in 5 minutes, the government is kidnapped by the militias in the city. So the sequencing is really the key to everything. And if you sequence in a wrong way, then you jeopardize any chance of succeeding in following steps. So I could say today we are still not on the wrong track. We are on no track at all, because nothing has been engaged. Libya went on the wrong track and is backtracking now. For Syria, if we can only get that sequencing right, I think is the big challenge at the moment. Yes, Denise, of course, the expropriation is key, but people might still go and fight for recovering their properties. Now, safety is step one, only step one. But I think a lot of people will go back, okay? I think a lot of people will go back, because you mentioned revanchisme or revenge feelings. We are not there. We are not on this path yet. I mean, yes, there are even worse scenarios. I don't know if they're worse, but different scenarios of horror in Syria. It's quite possible that this might come one day, but at the moment there is no such fear. No such fear. The young people who left the country because they feared arrest, these people for now are sending back their families, many of them, and not going back. They would like to join the family and be with their children and family if those key measures are taken. Yes, and then we have a big fight on land. I do not know what the answer is. There is no limit to how much expropriation is taking place, and that is not recent. That is over 50 years, 50 years of land confiscation and no respect for property rights.
Thank you, Dr. Osman.
Okay,
3 minutes, please.
yeah, I only have a few minutes, and I collected at least 7 questions, so I'll try and go through them fast. On the first question, in the paper, I basically do focus on the notion of propaganda and position the Crimean War, as it's been argued, as the first information conflict, mostly coming from the fact that the telegraph had been developed at that point, and so you could have almost daily updates on the war and be able to then demonize your enemy, and also report on the ongoing, basically the ongoing conflict. And I draw that forward to today, where we live in a world where the only way to achieve victory is basically through the information war, the so-called fake news war, that no one ever wins, I think. In terms of a number of the questions which I kind of have drawn together about what's really going on, like, you know, and in the paper I do very much talk about the U.S. intervention in Yugoslav's the wars of succession and the expansion, eastward expansion of NATO into the Baltic states, but also the failure to repay the peace dividend that the United States had basically promised, because the U.S. didn't have to spend money on defense, it could give some of that to Russia, and it's never paid. That created the environment into which Primakov came. He had a particular sort of discourse that was right for a particular time. Putin, I believe, operates in a world of bricolage when it comes to all of these things. You take whatever is useful at the time and you run with it. When it no longer becomes useful, and Dugin is a perfect case of this, Dugin does, you know, has access at one point, and then he's not allowed in the Kremlin gates on another point, so he goes and hangs out in Finland instead. And so this is very much how Russian foreign policy, I think, is operating on a framing level around the world. In terms of whether or not it's actually believed or you know, is it structured, I'm not sure that Putin actually believes anything. I think that he uses, again, he uses what's at hand and he tries to operationalize it. In terms of the questions about actually insurgency within inside Russia, there is evidence, I mean, there was this substantive evidence that there was already the returning fighters who had this experience, that they didn't learn it in Chechnya, they learned it in Syria, they learned it in Iraq, and they've come back to Russia basically to then engage in terrorist activities. There is enough of these stories that are coming out that it was a narrative that Putin was able to put to the Russian people and thus to the Duma to be able to get this support. Central Asia at this point in time, I don't think it's factoring in that much. I think Russia is really more focused on the North Caucasus and then people living in St. Petersburg and Moscow. And basically he says, we have this narrative that the United States often would use, we have to fight them over there so we don't have to fight them in our streets. And so that it does tie into it. So this notion of fighting the war against barbarism and anti-civilization is always tied to the war against terror at home and terror abroad. And so it really is difficult to sort of pull those two things apart. On the notion of archaeology, I think the last questioner brought up a great point about this sort of economy that is going on. I highly recommend, there's a paper by Russo and Giusti who talk specifically about the Bamyan Buddhas and also Palmyra, and the notion there is a political economy of destruction versus actually stealing it and selling it. And it's outsourced to the local people. It's not ISIL that's doing it. They're paying people to go and get the things that can be moved and sold, and they're just basically given a percentage. But if it can't be moved, then you blow it up for propaganda value, and I think that's a really interesting area for scholars to operate in right now. Is there a new Cold War on? I'm not totally convinced. I think, you know, the old principle, if you break it, you buy it. I think Russia is happy to have both broken and begun to fix, as you point out, Syria, because I think in their long-term economic and geostrategic issues, I think it's just going to be a continuation of policies that have been going on since the 70s and 80s. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Basma, for very interesting and thought-provoking presentations. We'll go for a break now, coffee break for 20 minutes maybe. We'll come back around 11:15. 11:15 in the schedule. If you want to come back earlier, I think that will be welcome.
Sure.